my name is Kathy Bansal. I am from Leather Design Department at NIF Chennai. Today I have rendered Airtex Auto Fabric with the help of soft pastels. These are Kohinoor hard mud pencils which I will be using for basic sketching. These are assorted soft pastels which I will be using for rendering this fabric which is called Airtex Auto Stripes. And this is the normal upside eraser. So here we start. I'm using 2H pencil for drawing it.
As the illustrator is going to be using dry pastel colors to do her rendering, she is drawing the outlines of the folds of the fabric kept for reference. She is using pencil outlines to clearly demarcate the areas that are to be filled with dry pastel colors. Here you can see that the illustrator is taking extra effort to do some shading, as the fabric has many dark folds in this area. She is shading that portion so that it becomes easier for her when she starts using the dry pastel. As the fabric kept for reference is of dark blue shade, the illustrator is using a blue dry pastel to draw the outlines which represent the folds in the fabric. Now the illustrator is using yellow color to draw some of the outlines. She is using yellow because the fabric has bit of highlights in the folded areas. Also note that there is a light colored stripe on the fabric kept for reference, and the yellow that she is applying mostly corresponds to the stripe which is of lighter hue on the fabric. Stop. The illustrator is now applying a dark blue shade which resembles the color on the fabric kept for reference. Here one must note that normally an illustrator applies the lighter colors first and then adds the darker shades. Here, as the fabric is of a dark shade, the illustrator has minimized her work by first applying the dark color, which is a dark shade of blue. Later on, she'll be adding lighter colors for the highlighted areas in the fabric kept for reference. Every illustrator has to make an assessment of the fabric as well as the resources available to do the rendering. One must apply colors according to the merits of the objective. For example, in this rendering, more importance is given to the final appearance of the rendering. Observe carefully how the illustrator holds dry pastel color, the amount of pressure she applies on the medium, namely dry pastel colors, and the kind of results she creates on the paper using dry pastel colors. You can now clearly see the difference in workmanship, the kind of effects one can achieve through manual rendering methods. The pressure applied on the dry pastel is very light compared to the rendering done earlier, where a lot of pressure was applied on the dry pastel to create the darkness visible on the fabric. Here you observe that a bit of paper is visible through the dry pastel rendering. That's because the illustrator wants to show that area as lighter than the adjacent dark blue. The illustrator has used a light blue dry pastel to make the rendering more colorful. You can see now the subtle blend of light blue and dark blue to resemble the fabric kept as reference. Now the illustrator has started using a bright blue right next to the dark blue shade applied earlier. Now watch the workmanship being done by the illustrator. See the kind of strokes applied by the illustrator. Here it's the depiction of tones that actually start resembling the fabric. Watch the limited movement of the illustrator's hand. The illustrator is right now adding a bit of highlights to the rendered surface. One should note the subtle movement of the illustrator's hand, how she holds the medium and how she applies the medium, so that the quality of the rendering is enhanced. The rendering also shows that the illustration is as realistic as possible. Now the illustrator is applying a lighter tint of color on top of the dark blue already applied. You must note the subtle difference in the tone variation. The illustrator has to practice a lot to create this kind of a subtle variation in dry pastel rendering. Now the illustrator is adding dark blue color to a very small area. The illustrator now has created a light blue stripe according to the fabric kept for reference. On top of that dark blue, the illustrator has added a bit of light blue color which resembles the fabric kept for reference. Note the illustrator's control on the dry pastel. The illustrator is very careful to add the required colors step by step. You can now get a feel of the fabric. This is the most important part in a rendering because in fashion illustration, the feel of the fabric gains a lot of importance. Observe how the illustrator fills a patch using dark blue dry pastel. Observe that the patch is not completely filled with blue, but it is filled in such a way that white surface of the paper is visible through the colors applied. When surface of the paper is visible through the color, it means that the surface is still capable of observing more colors. You can see that the illustrator had started adding a green tint on top of the dark blue which was earlier applied. Note how the illustrator uses the medium without disturbing the adjacent areas in the rendering. You can now clearly see the white stripe starting to appear in the rendering. This white stripe is found in the fabric kept for reference. You must also cleanly observe that this white stripe is not continuous. If you observe the fabric thoroughly, you will understand that there's a lot of play of light and shadow on the fabric kept for reference. You can see in the rendering that the illustrator has broken the continuous white stripe with little bit of dark blue. This is what adds naturalness to the rendering. In case if you leave that white stripe as a continuous line, then the feel of the fabric might get affected. Now you can clearly observe that the rendering has started closely resembling the fabric kept for reference. The rendering also clearly shows the folds and creases on the fabric. Closely observe how the illustrator adds white outlines to the rendering. This white line is the bright highlight seen on the auto text fabric kept for reference. These are the highlights that define the fabric as per the visualization of the illustrator. Without such highlights, the rendering might start looking dull. One, as an illustrator, has to add interest to the rendering. Only then the viewer will start enjoying the picture. Observe how the illustrator is adding a bit of green. The way the green is being applied actually resembles the light and shadow visible on the fabric. So one has to use the sharp edges of the dry pastel to create such effects. Closely observe how the illustrator has rendered these shiny stripes. The amount of pressure applied on the dry pastel is very minimal compared to the pressure applied in darker areas. So the illustrator has to have a lot of practice and patience to create these kinds of realistic effects. Closely observe how the illustrator applies colors on the light stripes. See the subtle variation between the colors applied. If you observe carefully, you will note that the light blue stripe now starts resembling a fabric. This is clearly dependent on the tonal variations that the illustrator has rendered. You can see this tonal variation in the light blue stripes and the white stripe. There, various tones are created by using a dark color, namely green. Observe carefully how the illustrator is adding a lighter hue to resemble the fabric kept for reference. Now you can clearly see the various folds and intricate details about the fabric kept for reference. Keenly observe how the white stripe stands out in this rendering. Also note the play between light and shadow on the surface of the fabric, which is rendered here using dry color pastels. You can notice how the illustrator applies a light color and dark color adjacent to each other. You can see a thin line being drawn on a lighter color. Also note how the illustrator gives the finishing touches by blending the light colors and dark colors. As dry pastel is a very soft medium, the illustrator has to use a lot of control to blend the light and dark colors as naturally as possible.
This is my render for the AirTex Auto fabric, and this is the fabric that I have used. Thank you for watching this video.